Hello friends, welcome back to the workroom. If you haven't been here before, my name's Ash, and this channel is about the fun of costuming and live action roleplay. Given that I've just come back from a LARP, I thought it'd be fun to take you on a bit of a tour of my costume for this event, the kind of decisions that went into making it, how I've adapted the costume across multiple events of playing the same character, and some ideas about where I'm going to go after this. I should also point out that for those of you who like sewing videos, some of these items I did make myself, and I'm going to take you through that process in some later videos. I was just very up against it time-wise before the event and didn't film a whole lot of this process. We'll get onto that. So first things first, some context. For most live-action roleplay games, you will need a costume. You almost always provide this yourself, and how you decide what to wear is a very unique and personal process, but it almost always starts with the costume brief. Or if you're here in the UK, the kit brief, because we call this kit. I'm aware that garb is also a word that's in use in other costumed activities, but in the UK LARP scene, we don't really use that word, it's kit. LARP kit briefs are hugely variable and often not very well written. That's a topic for a later video, but also on top of your kit brief, you might look at other information about the game setting or the game themes and come up with ideas based on that. So this game, the kit brief was pretty good, fairly relaxed. I think I've described it to other people as, I don't know, wear a waistcoat. It's a fantasy world that is mid an industrial revolution. It's not exactly the same as our industrial revolution. Things are happening at different rates and in different places. It is also immediately post Civil War. There was a revolution, the monarchy was overthrown after a period of great civil unrest. Also there are monsters and questionable magic. So out of this set of information and a few other elements like what my skill picks were, it's a very combat heavy system, what kind of combat I was going to be involved in. Based on all of that, I picked out a couple of key ideas to take forward with designing the costume for my character G. G is not his full name. He is in fact Reginald Timothy Aurelius Fanshawe Smythe the third, and for a variety of reasons, some of them external pressures, because the monarchy's been overthrown, being a member of the nobility is not great and likely to get you kicked when you're down, but also he in of himself is quite uncomfortable with his family and his heritage. So that's some of the key ideas I was starting with. I know that this is a game inspired by the early Industrial Revolution, but also not quite. It's sort of early Victorian, but some things are also quite Regency, but also some things are quite late 18th century. So for example, we're still really using muzzle-loading muskets and pistols, but the country has a established and fairly extensive railway network. Also, typewriters exist, as do photographs. So it's actually, the technology is over a wide period, things are happening at different rates. That to me said that I could draw on a bunch of periods from sort of 1790 through to like 1860 as inspiration for this costume. Now let's also talk about the fact that there's this revolution and civil war that's just happened. I originally played the first weekend-long event of this system. Really enjoyed myself, loved the system, loved the game, loved the player base. Realized I had made the wrong character for this game. Seeing how the game played on the ground, I have misjudged this. I've built a close combat character when in reality this is it's a system that has guns. Mid-range combat is way more common than close-up, and also I just enjoyed that more. I generated a character that I thought was going to be, she was a revolutionary, but she was an extremist, and she'd done some stuff during the revolution, and I thought like other people would engage with that and challenge it, and then I hit play and realized that every single player character in this setting is extremely dodgy, with a couple of notable exceptions. The kind of playstyle and the kind of interactions I had in mind were not what was going to happen with that character, and I could have retired her or just restatted her between sessions, but I decided instead to, look, someone said unless anyone wants to volunteer to be ritually sacrificed in order that we can fight the big bad, we're gonna have to find another way. And I already already knew I didn't want to keep playing this character, so you know, it just seemed like the logical thing to do. And I feel like that experience really sets the tone for what this game is like. I unfortunately missed the next event. It clashed with something, I couldn't make it. And then I played the third weekend-long event as my new character, G, having also roped in some of my friends to play as childhood best friends who'd now grown up and ended up on opposite sides of the war. And that event was, unfortunately, October of 2019. So the subsequent event didn't happen for 3 years. Did I work on my kit in that time? No. Let me explain why. When I originally created G, I had just come off the back of a 4-year campaign LARP in which I had made new costumes for every event, and for the final event I made 4 completely new costumes. It was actually 5, but I had all the pieces for outfit number 5 already because I made my gambeson reversible, plus armor, plus the floor-length fur-lined cloak that I had hand-painted the exterior of, plus, hang on, this is something I commissioned for that character. I do not have the skill set to make this. The very wonderful Silverleaf girl made this for me. This is brass. This is Sculpey, which is itself not light, but I cannot overemphasize enough that this is actually metal. It's also hollow inside because this part is a scroll case. And somehow I got all of this onto a train to travel to the event. I didn't want to do this anymore. So for G, I designed a costume that I wasn't going to have to change. Let me put this away and I'll explain that. G was a member of a noble family. He was the son of a duke, which is the highest status of nobility in this country after the royal family. He was not the preferred one in line for the dukedom. He also made some choices. So he'd been shipped off to university to keep him out of the way. When the revolution broke out, his father sent him an army commission, told him to come back a hero or die trying. The royalists lost the civil war. G deserted, spent 6 months sleeping in ditches on the run from the revolutionary authorities, trying to get home and basically finish the one last thing that he'd promised to do. He then massively overcharged a magical ritual trying to do the thing he'd promised he was going to do. It blew up in his face and he woke up in handcuffs in the hands of the organization that the players of this game represent, who are the secret government agency there to deal with magic and the supernatural. So I wanted a military uniform that had been extremely heavily distressed, and with no means nor resources to access new clothes, I was just going to wear this for the whole campaign and not make any big changes to it. I had not, of course, anticipated that I would have 3 years of downtime in the middle with no LARP, but there you go. For my first event, what I started with was a shirt from Primark. I actually think I got it from a charity shop, but it was originally, yep, that's pre-marché. So it was a very, very cheap shirt that looked kind of roughly and LARP-like, and a pair of the Primark trousers that I live in, apparently, despite the fact that they don't actually fit me that well. The first thing I did with these is that I stuck them into a pot with either strong tea or weak coffee. I then also applied fake blood to them. I put them in a bathtub and poured literal mud all over them and rubbed it in, and I also attacked them with a cheese grater. I did all this fairly organically. The trousers aren't too bad. There's 1 or 2 big holes in there, but in general they're all right. The shirt really got drenched. I also stuck some fake blood on there. It's accumulated more fake blood over the event, but I also specifically wanted one specific tear in it because there's one specific injury. I agreed with another player that because G had been doing some crime in order to survive, not very well, it has to be said, a friend of mine was playing an agent of the law, let us say, in this setting. She would have tried to apprehend G. G got away, but did get injured in the process. And I actually came in for the first event with a prosthetic silicone gunshot wound glued to the back of my shoulder, and there's a tear in the shirt that matches that, and there's also a bullet hole in the jacket that I created. Brings me onto the jacket. When I decided that I wanted to play someone who'd been in the military, there wasn't a lot of information in the guidebook about that, so I contacted the refs and said, can I free freewheel this, or do you have a specific idea of what the military uniforms for this country look like? And the response was basically, we figure there's a lot of military uniforms because there's a lot of like strong regional identities going on in this country. Also because we just use whatever we've got. If we had to imagine what the ideal military uniform for this specific region that you're from would look like, we're thinking of Sharp's rifles. Then I had to go have a bit of a sit down because, oh boy, Sharp's rifles was formative. And then I set about making myself a Regency-esque military jacket. So they did say dark green. They also said the color of the royal family is purple. So if you can incorporate some purple, please do. I also decided that the rifles notoriously don't have brass buttons, allegedly because they thought if they gave them brass buttons, they'd sell them. But I decided that I wasn't going to put any buttons, rank insignia, metallics onto this jacket because if G had those, he would have sold them to buy food. And so I made this jacket from a piece of poly wool I had in my stash. I used some scraps to do the black cuffs. I used a deep purple satin for the lining. I have a panelled jacket pattern with a bottom waistband. I've used this pattern so many times. It's just a really good like basic jacket pattern. With this one, because I didn't put the bottom waistband on, it's slightly cropped. So it has that slightly high-waisted Regency men's aesthetic. I also obviously put the braid on the front. Now originally I only had time to put a single line of braid for every detail. The extra braid, I got about half of it on before the second event I played, and I finished the rest of it in time for the third event. That's been a big feature of this costume, that I've worked on it when I can, and if stuff's not finished, it doesn't matter. That's been really good for me. I've previously had some proper meltdowns over trying to get everything done in time or setting too high a bar. I seem to have finally hit the groove where I'm like, okay, half of my braid is done for this event and the other half isn't. You know what? No one's gonna care. Literally no one's gonna care. I also attacked this with a cheese grater. I also put mud on it. It did not stick. Biggest thing is obviously I made a hole in the exact spot. The satin lining puffs out of it. I used a lighter to singe it just to really sell the idea that it's a bullet hole. Because the trousers sit quite low on my hips and the jacket was sort of cropped, I had some awkward shirt middle going on, so I also made myself a sash. There was just a strip of the jacket fabric and a strip of the more purpley satin that I had sewn together. I deliberately didn't finish the ends. I attacked it with a cheese grater. I got it muddy. Generally what I was going for with this was the idea that even as the son of a noble family and even as an officer, this country was in the middle of a civil war that they were not winning, and there wasn't necessarily the time or the money to make beautiful dress uniforms for everyone. You got what you got. The final piece of clothing that I added to this costume was a coat. This is a aquascutum trench coat that I found at a market for 15 quid. It's way too big for me, and it's also quite old. Having a big shabby overcoat, one, hid the jacket enough that I could reveal the jacket, but also it fit over the rest of as much costume as I wanted to wear, including the bandolier, which I'll talk about accessories in a second. The most important reason I had this though was just that it was waterproof. And sometimes you have to make decisions like, am I going to be able to go out fighting in the rain? Props wise, obviously weapons, I have two cap firing flintlock pistols. The system doesn't use caps, you just have to have something that looks appropriate and that you can point, which I love. For the first event, I just stuffed these in my belt because I didn't have anywhere else to put them. I also had this bandolier, which I bought off a leather crafts person, and honestly, I just love it. I didn't have a specific character in mind when I got it, but I find that actually it completes a lot of outfits, and having the sort of cross-body arrangement just balanced the silhouette nicely. I have a couple of really key accessories. I didn't want to give G a lot of noble trappings, but I picked out one ring that I thought looked good, just to have something. I don't think I've ever really established what it is, but there's obviously a reason that he chose to hang on to this. This is a Victorian horror game, so I have my anatomical heart pin. I also needed something to be able to attach bits of paper to my jacket. That's how you do magical armor in this system, is you put symbols on yourself, and the way I do that is I pin bits of paper onto me. Because we were playing as a group concept, we decided we were going to have an item that identified unified us as a group. And what we settled on was I actually broke a plate. So we each have 4 shards from this broken plate, and when you put them together, they match up. I also have 2 rings on here. This is canonically G's parents' wedding rings. He's hanging on to those for reasons, not ruling out they get used in anger in one of these games to come. So the pistols covered my weapons skills. The bandolier covered my requirement of having lots of bits of paper on me at any given time, because I love this system, but there are so many bits of paper. I also needed to use my magic skills. I needed a focus for evocation, which is the combat magic, and I needed a ritual kit for ritual magic, which is the slower, long form, big effects magic. I had a deck of cards that had been in a bag that had got wet, so it was kind of ruined. For semi-obvious reasons, I picked the Ace of Spades and the Queen of Hearts as the 2 cards to be on the outside. I wrapped it up with the string and I sealed it with wax. I wanted it to look battered and improvised, and given everything that happened, water damage was very appropriate. It was also just great to be able to use something that was otherwise unusable, but originally very nice. For my ritual kit, I decided to use tarot deck. I also have spread cloth that came with one of my tarot decks. It was the right aesthetic for what I wanted. I decided that the kind of aesthetic magically that I wanted G to go for was very much early 20th century Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. That felt appropriate for a vaguely 19th century character who'd spent most of his time at university. I also really like having a tarot deck, and I picked a deck that I thought was very appropriate for this setting. I like having this because, aside from anything else, it gives me something to do to interact with people when I'm not in the middle of plot stuff. One of these days I will probably make a video about reading tarot at LARPs. I love it, not only because it's a really good way of interacting with other characters, it's a really good way of drawing out other people's backstories and getting them to talk about themselves, but also at a LARP, you don't pull any punches. I feel like when you read tarot in normal times, you pull out the death card and you go, well, it's not bad. There's a lot of positive things about this, and in a LARP you can just go, oh no, oh I'm really sorry. It's probably fine. It's basically a mechanism for very elaborate character assassinations in the game space. I really enjoy it. And then the final thing that I put together for the first event, which was something I'd never really done before, and I don't know that I would do for many characters, but it's worked out quite nicely. I wrote a diary. I always have a notebook on hand for characters anyway, because you always need to write stuff down, always. I also knew I wanted to have, as I said, the magic armor is put symbols on yourself, so I have a bunch of historical magic nonsense that I've distressed, and that I use that in the rituals, I use it as magic armor, but I wrote a fairly extended diary. It's got extra ephemera in it. As I've picked up new things as we've gone along, I've added them into the books, I've written about my experiences. It's been stolen by other characters and read. This was good, this was good. And so that was basically my costume for the first event I was at, and a really good time was had by all. I only cried like 3 times. I killed a whole bunch of monsters and one of the other player characters. It was great. So then there was no LARP for 3 years, and for health reasons, when LARP did start up again, I wasn't in a great place to be able to do events. In the end, I ended up going to the last event but one back in autumn of last year, very last minute. I had very little time, basically got the go-ahead to go about 3 weeks before the event, so I didn't really have time to do anything. What I did do is borrowed a shirt off one of my friends. She'd played the previous event with me. It was her player character I killed. Wasn't deliberate, that was a thing. At one point, G ended up wearing one of her shirts, so that was a thing we just decided that he'd hung on to, and as his only other clothes, this is what he wore for this event. One thing I did do, I had time for one project, and so the one thing I did do is I decided that the pistol situation wasn't really working for me, and I had a go at making some holsters. I'm still very new to leathercraft. They didn't turn out the best, and in the end I didn't use them a lot that event anyway, so they've mostly been used in the most recent event, and now I have some feedback. They're slightly too big, the guns sit too low, but they were really simple. Cut out some leather, rivet it together. The most complex thing I did was cutting the lace design into some contrasting leather. I quite like how this turns out. I was a bit messy with it's just glued in place. Why would I do anything more substantial than that? They're fine. I think I'm going to add probably take some foam, wrap it in either more leather or maybe velvet, and stick it inside the top and inside the very bottom, just to make sure that the pistols don't slide all the way down inside, and to give it some stability, because this is quite a soft leather. I wouldn't really have picked quite a soft leather if I hadn't just been using stuff I already had. Brings me to the most recent event. This event, I knew I was going. I booked as soon as bookings opened. There was still a chance that I would have to drop out for health reasons, but it wasn't a good chance. With about 2 months to go, I went, you know what? This guy has spent 2 entire events complaining that he only has one shirt. I don't have any big projects on at the moment. I haven't costumed a LARP character in a long time. Let's make some kit. So I made an ordered list of what I wanted in order of how important it was. And this included breaking it down into some things could hit play not finished and be okay. So in order, the first thing I wanted was a shirt. I want to be clear that I did not originally set out to entirely hand sew this shirt. That just happened somehow. So because this game does not have one defining historical period that it's based on, I decided I was going to do something that I love, smushing historical periods together and making them be friends. So with this shirt, originally was going to make a 18th century shirt. I've sort of kept the sleeves, but then I decided that actually I really liked Nicole Rudolph's early Victorian shirt that she made for her Gonzo cosplay. So I ended up combining elements of the two. It's been washed and I've ironed it, but it's not ironed as well this time around, so I'm gonna have to steam it. So I gave this shirt a placket in front with buttons and tucks, giving it a very generic hybrid between time periods collar. Now that I've worn it, this collar is not tall enough. It sneaks down under the cravat and it just doesn't quite reach. We can fix that for next time. Early Victorian shirt had very conservative sleeves. I'm not about that life. I want big, fluffy, voluminous 18th century sleeves. But what I also did, I'm gonna have to figure out how to iron these back in, is I smocked the top of the sleeve heads. It sits very nicely on my bicep and looks very decorative and very bougie. I love smocking. I feel like there's probably a video in that because every time I do it, people are like, oh, I really want to learn how to do that. It's so easy. Honestly, the worst thing about it is the time you spend marking up the grid. So this is entirely hand sewn. Seams are flat felled throughout. Because of where I'm at with my LARP kit journey right now, I wasn't going to invest a lot of time and energy into something unless I was going to literally wear it in my everyday wardrobe. So I took the time to make it something that could be washed in a regular washing machine. Not got time to hand wash anything. I expect to get a lot of wear out of this. You will probably see it in future times. The only thing is it is very see-through and a little snugger on the chest than I wanted. I should have made it somewhat bigger. I'd need to wear something over it because I can't wear something under it. The next thing on my wish list was a waistcoat. Now actually, I wanted 2 waistcoats. I was referencing Nicole Rudolph's Gonzo series because I love the Muppet Christmas Carol and I love that costume and I love how bonkers early Victorian men's fashion is before they get all boring. And I loved the idea of, because I knew I wasn't going to be making a new jacket, there is no way G was parting with his military jacket. I liked the idea of having 2 waistcoats. But I would have accepted going to the event with one, so I started with 1 waistcoat. There are not a lot of good resources focuses on menswear, historical menswear. This is a problem. We're not going to get too into sexism in historical costuming. There's not a lot of resources for historical menswear. I was a bit limited in what I had access to. My options were the cut of men's clothing, which didn't really have a waistcoat for the eras that I wanted. Actual historical tailoring manuals, which are when you see these very elaborate things like the Keystone Cutting Guide, that is late Victorian. The early tailoring manuals are like, it's about this shape. We're not even going to tell you how to measure it. This is the shape you're aiming for. Just, you know what you're doing, right? I don't. I absolutely do not. I settled on the least challenging to draft option, given that I was on a time limit, which ended up being the 1790s waistcoat from Costume Close-Up. This is based on the Colonial Williamsburg collection. I have a complex relationship with this book. On the one hand, I really appreciate that it has some more normal person clothes in it than, say, Patterns of Fashion does. I also really appreciate that it has almost as much, if not as much, menswear as womenswear. Don't get me started on the people who complain that this is mostly a menswear book. It's pretty much 50-50. Gosh, doesn't that remind you of some other things? However, Costume Close-Up it itself states that it was not written with the idea that you would use these patterns to try and recreate the garments. So the patterns are not really set up for you to scale them up out of the book. I don't know what they thought people were going to do with this book. It's just very confusing, but the summary version is there are patterns, they do have a scale, they're not gridded, there's not really any help for scaling them up and indeed resizing them, which obviously I am not a standard men's size. I need to rescale things pretty heavily. But it was 4 pattern pieces. I'm okay at pattern drafting, and I went, you know what, let's just try it. Turns out, whatever I did, and like I said, I will at some point make a video so I can show you what I did. Whatever I did just worked. They fit great and they look amazing. So the first waistcoat I made was out of, this is a kimono wool. The back is a scrap of silk satin that I just had lying around. I just lined it in random bits of poly cotton that I had. There's no structure in this, it's single layer. I made my life way too difficult. I used the random scraps to make a mock-up. I tried the mock-up on. I went, yes, this is amazing and exactly what I want. And then I said, well, why don't I just use this and sort of add the outer on over the top. This involved more hand sewing than was actually necessary. I absolutely love about this waistcoat that it has these shoulder extensions. It means it fits over the top of your shoulder really beautifully. I also decided if I only got one waistcoat done, it would be this waistcoat. It was basically done. So I put buttons and buttonholes on this one. I decided, because I never have buttons on hand, to actually use fabric buttons. So it's just a circle of fabric that is gathered up into a hard little ball. It's worked great. It looks great. It fits me really well. I love it. It's amazing. And at that point, 3 things left on my list: a cravat, a second waistcoat, and an overcoat. This is not the order I did them in for the purposes of this video. We're going to talk about the second waistcoat now, because we've had first waistcoat, but what about second waistcoat? For second waistcoat, I had this, and it was a scrap. It's like a brown dupioni with a pink satin stripe through it. And I really wanted to make this into a waistcoat ever since I bought like a bundle of silk scraps, and one of them was this, and I was like, that's a waistcoat. It was not big enough to make a waistcoat. When has that ever stopped me? So this waistcoat is actually about an inch shorter than the other one. It's a second waistcoat. That doesn't matter. The lining of the fronts and the back is a brown silk satin that I just have. It was going to be a Victorian, or part of a Victorian bustle dress that I never got around to making. I don't think I'm playing that game again, unfortunately. I have no reason to make all of the Victorian bustle dresses that I had planned, other than I like Victorian bustle dresses. We shall see. With this waistcoat, especially since it was going to be hanging open, even though I want to be able to wear it on its own one day, I decided to give it some more structure. I also needed to heavily piece the outer. One of the fronts has 1 seam in it, and the other one has about 1 million, and one of those seams is actually coming apart, which is very disappointing, but I'll fix that. I was very impressed with my pattern matching. The outer is mounted onto a layer of linen, which is bright green, but no one knows. No one can tell. You can't see it. And then there's additionally a piece of blackout curtain lining, I think it is. It's just some heavy fabric that I had, which is pad stitched into the fronts. That's what's giving the collar its roll line, is just pad stitching. Pad stitching is one of those things that's extremely easy to learn and I think extremely difficult to master. I don't seem to be able to do, which way round is concurve and convex? If I'm doing the roll line, I'm bending the fabric over one of my fingers and working onto the fold so the fabric's curving away from me, brilliant. If I'm working on like the inside of the front and the fabric's curving towards me, that doesn't seem to work. And I have since realized that I could have just flipped it over and worked from the other side, and then it would have. Either way, the pad stitching was mainly just to hold layers together and reinforce it. In this case, the roll lines turned out great. This doesn't have buttons and buttonholes yet. There is so little of this striped fabric left that the buttons, I think I'll do fabric buttons again, but they're going to be of the brown satin. I think that's going to be fine, if not great. This looked amazing, just worn open on top, peeking out from under my jacket. I thought it was great. Honestly thrilled to have a waistcoat pattern that really fits me. I'm a simple queer with simple needs. The cravat, I knew there was a non-zero, if not significant chance that this was going to end up covered in flake blood and wrapped around someone's arm or whatever. Oh, it smells of his perfume. Nice. I cut a square out of the only piece of cotton that was big enough to make a cravat out of, which turned out to be some cotton organdy, so it pressed great. Hand sewed a hem in because I've lost control of my life. It was something I could do on a train. It wasn't too much of a problem. Followed an online tutorial for folding it and tying it. Very happy with that, except for, so cravats vary in size somewhat. The size range I was given was 30 to 33 inches along the side. I went with 30 because I was short on fabric. I think I need a bigger one. I think I need a 33. I'm going to potentially look into maybe getting G a silk one for next event, because that didn't end up covered in fake blood. Everyone was very respectful. The boy maybe needs a silk cravat for next event. It's the final event. I'm gonna go all out. And then the final thing I wanted to make was an overcoat. So we weren't sure what the weather for this event was going to be like. It ended up being gorgeous. At like a month out, it looked like it was going to pour with rain all weekend. Welcome to Britain in spring. I had this, it's a very thin, very dense wool. I've had wools like this that have been described as either a Melton or a boiled wool. This is thinner than anything I've had before, but it has the same texture and it has the same ability to not really fray. I looked through the books that I have and anything that was online to look at drafting a late 18th century Regency, early Victorian overcoat. They were all nightmares. The cut of men's clothing had something that I thought was about right, but I just looked at drafting from the cut of men's clothing is really annoying. Even more annoying than costume close-up, which is impressive. You gotta remember that the cut of men's clothing is quite old. So in the end, I pulled out a commercial pattern that I'd used before. It's the McCall's Civil War uniform pattern. So we're already going like historically adjacent. When I used it previously, I had made it smaller in the chest and shoulder because I'm smaller in the chest and shoulder. Shoulders are still a bit big on this. I think I want to bring them in a little bit more, especially for something I was throwing on over the top. That's great. A little bit oversized is great. To make that pattern more closely resemble the historical patterns I've seen, I combined the front and side back pieces. So this coat has a center back seam, a side back seam, and that's it. The side back piece wraps all the way around to the front. 2-part sleeves I left as they were because 2-part sleeves are great. Instead of using the skirt panels that came with the pattern, I drafted a half circle. I wanted more swoosh and less sewing. The fabric wasn't wide enough, so instead of using 1/4 circle pattern, cut it in half so I could cut 4/8. This also allowed me to put pockets on the side seams, because one thing I've noticed about systems where they give you a lot of bits of paper and stuff, pockets. So I've got big deep pockets in my side seams. This coat doesn't have hems. Wool is such that I just left the edge raw. To make it look less unfinished, I have used some very heavy top stitching throughout the coat. I did it in pink because why not? I already had the pink waistcoat, and the lining material I wanted to use, which is actually a silk. I bought it off V Birchwood. I bought it off Vassy because it was damaged, couldn't be used for anything else, and I think lining a coat for a rakishly disheveled character would work perfectly for that. I did not get as far as putting the lining in. That's something that I want to do, but because of the way the coat is constructed, I knew I could make the outer shell, and as long as the main construction was down, I would be going back in and adding the lining in by hand anyway. So it was completely fine for the coat to hit play in this situation, and I'll add the lining for the final event or after even. It doesn't matter. The Again, this is something that I think I'm going to get a lot of wear out of in general. It's a pretty good coat. And then finally, there was a couple of extra accessories. So I was putting my notebook down all the time and losing it. So I made a notebook holster. I just had a couple of little buckles lying around. I used some scrap leather and some rivets. It doesn't work great. Pretty much the best thing I've come up with so far. So we're probably just going to deal with that. It didn't take very long and it didn't take a lot of materials. And so the fact that it's not really going to be usable for anything else is kind of neither here nor there. And also, so G ends up having to do some babysitting. I think that's probably the most non-spoilery way I can describe that. And so I decided to bring some coloured pencils. This is a baby's colouring book. Because what is LARP for, if not trolling your best friends? Overall, I'm incredibly happy with this costume. I'm really pleased about the fact that certainly some of the newer pieces of kit I'm going to just wear, which is a really big shift from where I was in 2019, where not only was I not really thinking about the reusability of kit, in my head it was still always costume. So even trying to make a costume that I wasn't going to have to make new things or find new things or make big adjustments to over the lifetime of playing the character, I was still choosing something that was never going to be useful again, and also that just wasn't clothes. Now I'm making clothes. The fact that they're very eccentric clothes doesn't stop them from being great clothes. I'm also really happy where I'm at with the final event of the system is going to be later this year, and there's a couple of tweaks I want to make. Maybe a new cravat, add the coat lining, buttons on the waistcoat, make some alterations to the holsters. That's kind of it. I did go back and forth on maybe making full front breeches, but we'll see. We'll see how I go. Fundamentally, I have trousers that work fine, so it's not essential. Likewise, the boots that I use are on their last legs, but I'm going to wear them for one more event and then probably get rid of them because they are dead. In general, I found the kit really comfortable, really easy to move in. This is a very active game. I also just really liked how I looked in it. I felt like a sexy Regency hero. And that's all I really want in life is, you know, someone in an empire-waisted dress to swoon in my arms. And I don't know, what else did Sharp do? Do some war crimes? LARP's a weird hobby. It may seem weird given that I have an entire channel devoted to costuming and making costume, and I really love making costume. I will always tell new LARPers and some experienced LARPers who need to be reminded that your kit is not actually very important. What matters is that you're there, what matters is that you're role-playing, what matters is that you are making game for other people and interacting and having a good time. But fundamentally, these clothes make me feel good about myself and about my character, and that does reflect on my general mental state when I approach the game. It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks about your kit, but if you feel good in it, that's really, really positive. I do intend to make videos a bit later about the shirt. I will be making another one. Be patient though, it's hand sewn. It's gonna take me a while. I might try and get a smocking video out at some point a bit sooner because that's not so difficult. I will also, because I'm going to be making more of them, do a video on the waistcoats and take you through the drafting process, and I will not be making another coat, but because I'm going to be putting the lining in, and I can also take you through how I altered the pattern and that. More videos on these subjects will be forthcoming. Unsurprisingly, I have a whole bunch of sewing videos planned for the next many months, but also sewing takes time and I do want to talk about LARP a bit more, so gonna try and, as always, find the balance between those of you who are only here for the sewing and those of you who are only here for me being incredibly salty about a hobby I allegedly enjoy. I've seen my viewer numbers. I know what you're doing. About a month ago, Bodice Ripper Regency fantasy Bridgerton hit the small screens and the YouTube costume community lost their collective minds. But let's be honest, quite a lot of them are about the costumes. Some people hate them, some people love them, a lot of people have strong opinions on Penelope Featherington. It sparked a whole big conversation about fantasy versus historical accuracy, creativity, what we value in costuming as viewers and creators, and it's inspired a lot of people to create their own cosplay or inspired Bridgerton costume. Only almost all these videos have one thing in common. They only talk about half the cast. Now, in fairness, Zach Pinsent did do a video about the men's costumes in Bridgerton, but he only really, in his own words, discussed whether or not they were historically accurate, not whether or not they were good. And I'm here to tell you that for a variety of quite complex and interesting reasons, particularly in the context of the show as a whole, they're garbage. Some disclaimers. 1. There will be major spoilers for the series from the outset. 2. We're going to be talking about gender and sexuality, including but not limited to female desire, toxic masculinity, queerness and depictions of queerness in media, and transgender experiences. If this is not your jam, that is your signal to leave. If you have a strong desire to express your displeasure that these are subjects I am discussing, or you think that this is an airport and you have to announce your departure, do not under any circumstances put that in the comments. Decent normal people have to read those. 3. This is indeed a video that could be summed up as, but what about the men's? I will not be discussing the female characters or female characters' costumes except by comparison. If you're not interested in that, no worries. There are literally dozens of other videos for you to watch. Setting the stage, what is Bridgerton and who is its audience? Bridgerton is not a traditional costume drama or historical story. The show is an alternate universe fantasy where attitudes towards race and skin colour are significantly different from what they historically were, and it's based on a series of romance novels which have already taken some liberties with the historical realities of the Regency period in order to tell engaging stories of romance and passion. For example, all-female gambling parties probably weren't a thing, but it's a really cool scene, it develops some characters, and it helps move the story along in an interesting way. The important takeaway here is that historical accuracy has already been well sacrificed on the altar of good storytelling, and but it's historically accurate is not going to fly as a justification for any of the things I'm going to discuss. If it is historically accurate, a decision was made for that specific detail to be historically accurate, and other options were always available. While I love romance novels and genuinely believe that everyone can and should enjoy them, it's kind of inescapable that the main audience for these stories is women. I would actually even narrow that down further to women who love men. The core theme of every traditional romance novel boils down to female desire, overwhelmingly for men, whether that's romantic or sexual or both. It's important to hold that in mind as we look at how the men in Bridgerton are depicted, because we're often not looking at men as main characters and agents in the story in their own right. The men we are seeing are expressly presented as men for women to desire. Or not. It's also important to remember that some of these men are explicitly men you, the female audience, should not desire, and that's going to get real relevant in just a minute. Setting the stage, part 2, the costumes. A big deal has been made out of the costumes for this series. On the one hand, yes, organically fans in the costuming world has reacted and responded to these costumes, but they were always supposed to. I think it's important to recognise that the people making Bridgerton wanted the costumes to have a massive impact. They've released behind-the-scenes details talking about their process, their design intent, how and why they've deviated from the historical norms. We've been given every indication that they've thought long and hard about every design choice in the costuming department, and been explicitly told that almost every major item was specifically made for this production. They have given themselves nowhere to hide. If a character is wearing something in Bridgerton, it's because the people making the show absolutely consciously wanted them to be. They have also, somewhat less explicitly, made it pretty clear that they think costume is a girl thing. There is a 4-minute behind-the-scenes video called Costumes of Bridgerton, which I have watched frankly too many times by this point. All of the actors interviewed in this video are playing female characters. All of the costumes you see featured or see people working on in this video, without exception, are women's costumes. Even in the clips from the show that they have chosen to intercut with the interviews, I counted more than double the number of women than men, and that was with me counting every single footman as a distinct character, even though they're wearing the exact same thing. Nearly half of the male appearances were just Simon. In the interviews with costume designer Ellen Moroznik, so sorry if I've mispronounced your name, there is a lot of talk about making things fresh and modern, about colour and detail, the use of glitter and handmade flowers and jewels and all these wonderful exciting embellishments, and as we'll see, none of them appear on the men. The men of Bridgerton. There are 9 main male characters I'm going to be discussing, plus a bit about the background extras. I've chosen to completely ignore Gregory Bridgerton, even though he has an equivalent-sized role to some of the characters I will discuss, because he's a child. It's a different category of human entirely. The Bridgertons. We're going to talk about the 3 adult historical AU Jonas brothers, Anthony Benedict and Colin Bridgerton, in one breath, because frankly, they look exactly the same. No, genuinely, I'm not great with faces, and it took me 3 episodes before I could tell Anthony and Benedict apart. During the day they wear blue, and in the evenings they wear black coats and pale white or ivory waistcoats. In fact, almost every man seems to wear a black coat and pale waistcoat to evening events, which is a very late Victorian to mid-20th century aesthetic. The idea that evening wear for men should be black and ivory with very little variation or individuality is quite modern, and one we will come back to several times over the course of the video. There are a couple of variations when Benedict is getting in with the artistic types. We do see him wear some more yellow. Colin gets a maroon coat at least once and tends to wear lighter blues in general. In particular, I appreciated the full pale blue ensemble he wore when announcing his and Marina's short-lived engagement, which honestly was one of those moments where the costume department has so clearly kicked the door in and stated their intent. I think Anthony wears a dark aubergine at one point when he's riding with Daphne. It's hard to tell because it's a very brief scene and it's easy to miss the odd splash of colour when it's so overwhelmingly blue. Other than the monochromatic evening wear, I think it's important to point out that if you've established blue as your main colour, which, okay, yeah, all the Bridgertons wear blue, it's a theme, yellow is not the most obvious contrast colour. The most obvious contrast colour is orange, but we have white, cream, and very rare splashes of yellow. That's another point I want to come back to. The Duke of Hastings. Simon comes next, not only as the male lead, but in that he has a very particular place in the visual narrative. He's got to look distinctly different from the Bridgertons, but still hot. The Bridgertons, including Daphne, wear blue and white, so he wears red and black. Literally going colour ABC here. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As the male lead, Simon gets some of the biggest variation in his colour palette. We do see him wearing some different coloured coats in some scenes. There's a buff one and a silver one. He's the only man wearing red in some of the balls. In fact, he's the only man wearing colour in some of the balls. And he gets some of the most exciting fabrics. A lot of his coats have different textures of velvets, whereas everyone else seems to have mainly wool or plausibly wool. And while there's a couple of flash waistcoats around, it's Simon who's consistently wearing these brocades with metallic golds in them. I want you to hold Simon in your mind for a moment while we think about Prince Friedrich. Prince Friedrich. Let's start with reiterating these costumes are not historically accurate. That uniform is definitely not period correct at all, so a very conscious choice has been made here. The prince is supposed to be the other man. He's what Daphne could have if she decides against following her passions, and he's not only got to be a direct contrast to Simon, he's got to be, you know, tempting. He's designed to look approachable, not too ostentatious, but very manly, while still being, you know, nice. And you can clearly see he's in blue and silver, so he coordinated with the Bridgertons really nicely and contrasts very well against Simon. The prince could have been elaborate as all hell. Like, let's be clear, you've seen what the Queen is wearing. His uniform could have been dripping in silver embroidery. He could have had a different outfit each scene, and he doesn't. He's kind of plain. He's got a very specific, simple, unadorned kind of masculinity. He's rich, he's down to earth, he's a soldier, which is totally manly, right? And that never really gets any more three-dimensional. When you put the Bridgertons and Prince Friedrich next to Simon, or, you know, the white romantic leads versus the man of colour romantic lead, there's something a bit interesting when you compare how they're dressed. Not only does Simon get a larger colour palette and just more clothes, he wears more bling in general. The brooch he wears in every scene, and in particular these waistcoats, which are pretty explicitly non-European in origin. I don't feel qualified, for obvious reasons, to extrapolate too much on this subject, but it's definitely something I noticed. This is an analysis of two halves, and it's where things get spicy. The men I've talked about so far are the romantic leads. In short, they're the men you, the audience, are supposed to find attractive, and they're not that interesting to talk about because they're very similar, and quite frankly, kind of dull. So let's talk for a second about the men you're not supposed to be attracted to. Will Mondrich. So it's hard to talk about Will's costumes because he doesn't usually wear a lot. And it's kind of misleading to say the audience isn't supposed to be attracted to Will. He's an exceptionally attractive, almost always shirtless man. He's strong, masculine, respectful of women, good with kids, but he's not a romantic lead. He's married and working class. And then he chooses to take the money and throw the boxing match while surrounded by landed gentry who only care about honour and reputation, which I don't like that the story did that. But this video is going to be long enough without getting into ingrained classism in Regency romance novels as well. He's wearing some very generic working class clothing in a couple of scenes, some Victorian-ish undershirts, basically what passes as a tight white t-shirt but looks kind of period. He appears at the Hastings ball at the very end, where again he's dressed like all the other men, because why would men's evening wear have variation? The only other remarkable scenes are extremely minor, but at the wedding he's the only man in red, as opposed to black or blue, and at the duel he's wearing tan. Simon's wearing red, Anthony and Benedict are in black and blue. It's that thing again where the black men are wearing more vivid and varied colour than the white men, and I can't tell whether it's intentional and another not very good attempt at drawing attention to race in the show, or if it's unintentional and just somebody's implicit bias showing? I mean, he's the only other significant man of colour in the show. He's working class, he's darker skinned than Simon, and he's usually shirtless. We see other male characters naked or semi-naked too, but not for the majority of their scenes. And let's be honest, usually with a scantily clad woman draped over them. There's a lot to unpack here, and I'm not the person to do it, but I'm also not going to pretend it isn't there. In the context of a show about female desire, there's some objectification in play here that there isn't with the romantic leads, and it's not entirely comfortable. Nigel Burbrook. Potential suitor and literal toad in human form, Nigel Burbrook wears grey. That's basically it, grey. Black jacket in the evenings, obviously the odd touch of blue-green in a waistcoat, but mostly grey. I can't get enough full-length shots of men in the series to say for certain. It feels like they cut his jackets to make him look shorter and wider, but this is fine nuance. Honestly, the heavy lifting here is being done by those sideburns. Once you start looking at all the other men in the cast, you start noticing things like how Nigel's waistcoats are actually the exact same cut as Simon's, which is the exact same cut as half the waistcoats in this show, as unlike the women's dresses, which play around with shapes and cuts a surprisingly large amount given they're sticking to an empire waist, just compare Daphne and Lady Featherington and Penelope, the men's costumes are all kind of homogenous. I don't think that's the choice I would have made. I would have wanted Nigel's costumes to be distinct. Basically what I'm getting at here is there's literally nothing remarkable about Nigel's costumes at all, which kind of works. I would have been inclined to make him more loathsome than forgettable, but sure, we're not supposed to like him, let's not give us anything to like. Lord Featherington. I have a guilty admission to make. Lord Featherington's costumes are my favourite. So let's start with the obvious. Colour. Lord Featherington gets what no other speaking male role in this cast apparently gets: multiple colours that are not neutrals. I get yelled at every time I say this, so let me explain what I mean. White, black, cream, brown, grey, navy or dark blue, and most shades of red are what I would consider neutrals. That is to say, a colour that you can match with any other colour without too much effort. It's not a perfect system. Navy and black can be a bit funky. Brown and black you should probably think about at least a little bit. But mostly if you have a palette of just these colours, you can throw on basically anything in your wardrobe and it's going to work. Even if you introduce a single accent colour, like, to pick an entirely random example, gold or yellow, the outfit's still going to look balanced and you're probably not going to clash anything. Lord Featherington not only gets some excellent greens, which are paired with rich blue or yellow brown, he gets purple. Not a dark purple either, it's the full Cadbury's wrapper, with a yellow cravat, and he wears variations on these in multiple scenes, so he leaves an impression of being a man who wears colour. colours. And they are astonishingly well chosen colours too. Multiple people have described these outfits to me as clashing, but they aren't. They're actually incredibly well balanced. If they were on a woman, we'd be celebrating these from the rooftops. Yellow is the perfect accent colour for purple. Their intensities are superbly complementary. And the outfit he wears to the garden party where Colin and Marina's engagement is announced, the trousers being the exact same blue as the brocade waistcoat but plain, and that grass green coat. So what's wrong here? Well, the problem is 50% Lord Featherington and 50% his wife. On the one hand, we aren't set up to like him. We know he's badly mismanaged the family fortune. He can't stand up for himself. When Portia confronts him about his gambling debts, he breaks down in tears. I wasn't about to go in for a third rewatch, so I can't say this for certain, but no other man in the series actually cries. They just brood. In short, Lord Featherington is presented as a failure, undesirable, unattractive. And then there's Lady Featherington. Throughout the series, we are constantly subjected to Lady Featherington set dressing the people around her. She colour coordinates her daughters. She intermittently takes charge of dressing Marina, the country cousin. She's overbearing, she's controlling, she has actually a completely fine sense of colour, but not necessarily of dress, and certainly not of taste. Yeah, I know, taste is a classist construct, but this is for a modern audience. We don't have time to get into that right now. And then there's the garden party at the end of the first episode, where Portia, Lady Featherington, isn't in attendance. Right as Penelope explains that she could never wear a dress like this if her mother is around, she points out her father, who's wearing navy, just like all the other men. So he's not just weak and undesirable, he's the most unmasculine thing of all, henpecked. We're supposed to think his wife's choosing his clothes for him. Lord Featherington hasn't necessarily been dressed to be unattractive. We're being told he's not attractive, he's not a good match, he's not a romantic lead, and being expected to associate this with him being more extravagantly dressed because it shows how under his wife's control he is. But wait! Maybe we can save this. There's one other male character who kind of gets to wear colours. Henry Granville. In almost every scene he appears in, except for evening balls, which evening wear. Man with a profession instead of a personality, Henry Granville wears some variation on maroon and red. As I've previously pointed out, basically still a neutral, but the only other man regularly wearing red is Simon, so he stands out. And he's not a bad character. He's an artist, sure, but unlike Will, he's a titled member of society. He's clever and witty and pleasant, unlike Nigel, and we're not presented with an overbearing wife like Lord Featherington has, so we can believe it's his own choice in clothing. In fact, it's pretty clear that, he's sexually involved with another man. Right. Cool. Yeah. Great. Awesome. Yes! Fine! Fine! I'm back. With reinforcements. So to recap. A male character is depicted as visually different from all the other speaking male characters because he's wearing a colour, not even a particularly unusual colour, like it's maroon. Lots of modern men's clothing is maroon. There's some other maroon jackets that appear on other characters, but no one else goes for fully maroon, waistcoat, trousers and all. He is made to clearly visually stand out, particularly from the other important men, basically by not wearing blue, and he's the only queer character in the show. So I don't want to get too off track. You're here for the costumes, and I totally get that. But even if this was a good depiction of a queer man in a work of fiction, which it 100% is not, colour coding your gaze is a bit weird. I said before that Lord Featherington isn't dressed to be unattractive. We're told he's unattractive and also he's visually distinct. Kind of the same thing is happening here. It's more subtle for sure. Henry stands out from the other men, but only if you're looking for it. And indeed you might not even realise why he looks different from the other characters. You just clock that he did. Terrible metaphors for sexuality aside, and I really can't double down enough on how weird, predictable and disappointing Henry's extremely minor plot thread is. Okay, no, can we just go back to all the stuff that's never explored in any way, like we never actually get to talk to his marriage of convenience spouse because she only gets one speaking line in the whole series. He says he loves a guy in a conversation to someone else entirely when we never speak to that guy at all either. We don't even see them actually be intimate with each other in a romantic way. We just get one weird voyeuristic fragment of a sex scene mid-housewide artistic bacchanal because what else would a gay man in society be doing except promoting sexual excess and the downfall of class boundaries in which we don't see the other guy's face at all? I hate basically everything about this. But let's get back to the costumes for a second. All of the significant romantic leads, the men that you, the audience, are supposed to find attractive, are fairly homogenous. There are some minor variations, but they wear the same styles and, more importantly, the same colours. The nice boys wear blue, the bad boy wears blood red and black. Based on the wardrobes of these characters, they could get dressed in the dark and probably still look just as good, because they only have this incredibly limited neutral palette. Even the boys who wear blue get one accent colour, yellow, which is the toned down soft version of what their accent colour should be, because, I don't know, is orange just a step too far? Too brash? Too obvious? Too notice me, I'm a follower of fashion? And then the men who are wearing colours that they might actually have had to think about, that is to say the men who have visibly paid attention to or had someone think about their clothes, are either being dominated by their overbearing wife or are attracted to men. And it's leading me to the conclusion that the creators of Bridgerton are expecting their, remember, overwhelmingly female and attracted to men audience to see men dressing outside of a very narrow norm, associate that with femininity, and conclude that they are unmanly and thus unattractive. I think this becomes even more obvious when you start looking at the background characters, who are by and large more colourfully dressed. There's lots of purples, reds and greens going on in the background, not to mention the fantastically colour-coded footmen in their livery, because we're building up this fresh, bright, high fashion inspired world that the costume designers envisioned. We're just not seeing it on the main characters, and the distinction here does seem to be that those extras are not supposed to be attractive. They're not there for us to get invested in or have feelings about, they're just there to make things look right. So why does this matter? But wait, I can pretty much hear you cry through the magic of YouTube. The primary audience for this show is women. Women who find men attractive. Why is it weird that the main male characters are men who have been made to be attractive to women? Because the template of an attractive man that this show offers is not only incredibly limited and restrictive, it's not actually representative of female desire. And it's gone the direct opposite direction to how they've chosen to design the women's costumes. Let's talk about trousers, because apparently every man in this show wears trousers. Again, not historically accurate, conscious choice. In fact, the only men we see at all in breeches and stockings are attendants to the Queen, and again, distinctly associated with femininity, in this case, overbearing femininity. When designing the women's clothing, for example, their undergarments, Bridgerton decided to make things as sexy as possible. Corsets with no chemises, pantaloons, which, yes, are sexier than petticoats, because there's a visible divide between the legs instead of nebulous skirts, which is kind of interesting in the context of a largely female and attracted to men audience, but sexism! We don't have time. However, it would seem logical that if that's what they're doing the men's trousers, okay, we can accept they're going to wear trousers because that's what a modern audience expects, would be more fitted. And they're not. When men's bodies are objectified in Bridgerton, which, let's be clear, they are, it's naked, so we can admire their very developed muscles and surprisingly smooth skin, rather than using the clothing to make them look sexy. We don't even get a full Colin Firth in the BBC's 1995 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, which frankly, in any even vaguely Regency-themed adaptation, should be illegal. Men's clothes aren't used in the series to accentuate their bodies, just cover them. And as previously stated, most of the attractive male leads have been dressed to look as much as possible like they haven't thought about their clothes at all. Men who clearly have something wrong with them. Are you beginning to see why this made me kind of uncomfortable? Hell, only one male character in the series properly cries, and it's presented as part and parcel of the most unmanly thing that has ever happened. Not only has he failed to provide for his family, but he has no idea how to solve the issue and must beg his wife for help. This is toxic masculinity 101. The idea that there's only one very specific way to be a man and to be attractive to women, and it involves not wearing colours, not being unique or creative except in very specific non-feminine ways, repressing your feelings, having a very idealised body but without letting anyone know that you took effort to have that body. And it's nothing new that romance novels are reinforcing a very narrow idea of what romance and desire looks like, it's just that it's the year of our Lord 2021 and Bridgerton was supposed to be fresh and new and an innovative take on the genre. I'm not trying to say that the romantic leads in Bridgerton are the worst, TM. Actually, compared to a lot of romantic options thrown at young women, they're pretty wholesome. Literally none of them have stalked, isolated, or violently tried to control their partner's every action, and yes, I know that is a low bar, but most of the time we don't even clear that. And it's presented as romantic. Given the choice between Simon and, I don't know, Edward Cullen? Simon every day of the week. They are better, they're just not that much better. Okay, but why does this actually matter? Let's assume we're all complex creatures, and even if we are attracted to men, we're not going to let our entire romantic and gender experience be shaped by a Netflix show. Toxic masculinity is something we can recognise and expand beyond. Bridgerton has had an impact on the costuming community unlike anything I have seen since early seasons of Game of Thrones, maybe Outlander. We're yet to see if it has legs, but it hasn't debuted, it's exploded. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about my experiences in costuming communities over about a decade as 3 different genders. If you're thinking to yourself, but there's only 2 genders, you know I had a whole bit written about how I don't have time to explain that gender is a spectrum, but actually, no, I have time. There are more than 2 genders. That's it. That's the whole explanation. There's not even an opinion, it's literally a fact. There's tons of historical as well as contemporary evidence from basically every culture that there has ever been. If that's new information for you, awesome! You learned something! Isn't that why you watch YouTube videos for learning new things? Gender is complex and wibbly and all over the place, and always has been. It's wild. Where were we? Here's the thing about costuming communities. In general, unless explicitly stated otherwise, everyone assumes female is default. I want to be really clear, I'm not in any way against spaces created for and by women, even when those spaces explicitly excluded me. Those spaces should exist. If you don't understand why they exist, you have literally millennia of history to catch up on. It should also go without saying that those spaces should be trans-inclusive, but apparently this is something that needs constantly repeating in small words for the people at the back. But costuming communities, while largely created and filled by women, also generally welcome and are happy to celebrate people who don't identify as women. They're just not always great at doing that in a non-explicitly gendered way. And even now when people are more understanding of non-binary identities, the communities I'm involved with are by and large massively more chill than the places I was hanging out in as a teenager and 20-something, and most people I interact with know my pronouns. They, them. Thank you for asking. There's still a whole bunch of assumptions that just show up on a regular basis. If I mention that I'm making an 18th century project, I will get questions about petticoats and stays. Literally nobody will consider that I might be making men's clothing unless I actively state that's what it is. And people will rarely get excited about men's clothing or talk about feeling inspired to join in the way they do when you're making a corset or gown. Because why would you? Men's clothing is difficult and boring. Obviously you're making a woman's costume. If I visibly do traditionally feminine things, nobody will notice, or if they do, they're unlikely to comment. The same is not generally true of people who explicitly identify as male, and it wasn't in my personal experience. Yes, I am hyper-aware that the fact you don't comment is because you all assume I'm female. Thanks for noticing. It's fine, really. Don't overthink it. People not commenting on my hair and nails except to ask where I got that colour from is the preferred state of existence for me. Now, full disclaimer. Experiences of a trans-masculine person and experiences of a cis man are almost certainly not the same thing. Also, my experience of being in costuming communities while identifying as male was almost exclusively limited to online spaces due to, well, the way I look and talk. And it was some years ago, and it was mostly cosplay back then, which at the time attracted a slightly interesting demographic. And being raised female gives you an extremely heightened awareness of when people are maybe slightly creepily kind of hitting on you. While I'm sure things have got better, being a man in costuming spaces was, for me, a basically endless parade of being put on a weird pedestal and being slightly creepily hit on. It's a time! So aside from being disproportionately celebrated for things women were visibly doing and doing much better than me, including, you know, wearing jewellery, having makeup, having nice nails and skin, speaking eloquently, being overly polite, things that people would seemingly never point out when women did it, things that nobody ever commented on when I was identifying as female, but literally always seemed to comment on when someone masculine presenting did. And aside from the fact that people still assumed that I would want to make women's clothing at some point, yes, that's a point we're going to come back to, people, largely women, also felt comfortable saying some kind of weird things to me that it was clear they didn't necessarily feel comfortable saying to non-costuming guys. As conversational openers with strangers go, gosh, I'd like to put you in a corset is a choice! But for me it comes back to the assumption of feminine as default. Presenting male in a costuming space, a space that was and honestly still is overwhelmingly female, marked me out as other and different and kind of objectifiable, but also led to assumptions that not only was I interested in feminine things, I was explicitly up for making and wearing women's clothing. The fact that for some people this was clearly a thing they were into was kind of secondary. Aside from the fact that that's a really problematic attitude to project onto a trans man in particular, it was repeatedly explicitly reinforced that more than the gender of the participants, women's costume was the norm. Because women's clothing was just better. It was easier, it was better documented, and it was more interesting, more creative, more colourful, more forgiving. It had a more interesting fit. You didn't have to learn tailoring, which was obviously an actual skilled profession that only actual professionals could do, not amateurs. You couldn't just learn it from a book or YouTube video. There were no resources. Men's clothing was difficult, and that difficulty wasn't worth it because it was also boring. It was something you kind of couldn't do, and that you obviously wouldn't want to. So how does Bridgerton fit into this? Bridgerton has inspired people. There are folks who would never have thought about getting into historical costuming, people who were intimidated by all the research and sources and period techniques, looking at the Bridgerton costumes and going, actually, I think I want to give this a go. They haven't just made Regency costume bright and exciting and creative and modern, they've made it accessible. They've opened up a door to the idea that maybe you don't have to do everything original practice, counted stitches, Bernadette Banner will be disappointed in you if you don't do enough research. And that's thrown open the double doors of the horizon to a whole new set of people who suddenly want to make costumes and have fun doing it. And they've literally only done it for the women. Because all men wear the same thing, in the same colours, and it's really hard to make, so why would you bother? Now, I am very aware that all along I've said that Bridgerton's main audience is women, and it makes complete sense that they would want to mostly appeal to women. But we are never going to get more non-women into the hobby. We are never going to shake the association of costume being a girl thing that boys shouldn't care about. We are never going to stop objectifying non-women in costuming as kind of feminine, or assuming that straight cis guys who want to sew are rare exotic curiosities, until TV shows and movies and whatever else stop doing this. We're never even going to get people of all genders branching out into making historical men's clothing, learning and sharing the techniques involved, and building up the depth of resources that there currently only is for historical women's clothing. And we're also going to continue reinforcing the idea that there's a specific box labelled sufficiently manly man. If you step outside it, you're weird and feminine and unattractive, or maybe special and feminine and available for being creepily hit on in costuming message boards. We can do better, and we can demand better from the media we consume. And now I'm going to go, I don't know, sew handmade flowers onto a waistcoat or something? That is a hard sentence to say. Why did I lead with that? Oh, hello. Particularly in the... I'm going to do that line again because I fluffed it. The window bird feeder was a better idea before I picked this as a filming position. Video are playing female characters. Thursday, go away. Oh, and I didn't clap. Is this the worst idea? No, cool. Thursday, go away. The techniques involved and building up the depth of resources that there currently only is for historical women's clothing. Last year I made myself this coat, based on a commercially available pattern but inspired by early 19th century men's overcoats. However, I really felt like it wasn't finished. I massively prefer a lined coat to an unlined one. So let's revisit this project together and, through some elaborate archaeology, I can show you how I went about creating this coat in the first place. And we can maybe give it a bit of a special upgrade I've been thinking about. The pattern is McCall's M4745, yes, the American Civil War uniform pattern, with some fairly hefty modifications I'll get into in detail a bit later. I've used and abused this pattern a bunch of times and I've kept all my modified patterns together, so figuring out which pattern pieces I want to use each time is a whole step in and of itself. I've got this rose-coloured silk for the lining. I'm not usually a 100% silk lining kind of guy, or rather I aspire to be that person, but my wallet says no. However, I bought this very cheaply from another costumer because it was damaged. You'll see when I'm ironing it, always iron your fabric before cutting out, especially if it's a lightweight fabric like this. It can make a really big difference in how accurate your pieces are. The big creases from being folded come out, but the very fine little crinkles don't. I think they're in there for good, and there's not really anything I can do about it at this point. That's fine for a lining though, so I don't mind. Once the fabric is ironed, I refold it in preparation for cutting. Having the fabric folded in half lengthways is necessary for a lot of cutting layouts, but additionally, when dealing with a piece of fabric this big, where it's not going to all fit on my cutting table at once, I think it's 8 or 9 meters in total, I like to stack the fabric in accordion folds so that I can pull more off the top as I go. There's actually not much to this pattern after modifications. 2 back pieces, 2 front pieces. Yes, these look kind of funky, I'll get into the details a little later on. The body of the coat was the main section I needed to alter for both size and style. I kept the pattern's original 2-part sleeves, but I did draft a new skirt. The original was fine, I just wanted a different style. A longer and more conical half circle shape, which is actually cut as 4 identical 1/8 circles. The silk fabric isn't quite wide enough to cut these on the fold, so I left the skirts until last and refolded the fabric widthways to accommodate them. The construction of the coat and the lining are basically the same and not very complicated. Sew together, clip the seams and press well. Two-part sleeves can be a bit of a nightmare for this, and there's a variety of things you can buy to make your sleeve pressing life easier, but honestly I've never found anything cheaper or that works better than tightly rolling an old towel into a sausage and stuffing it inside your sleeve. Just mind those fingers. I'm lining this the old-fashioned way, which is more time-consuming but in many ways simpler. Once I've made up the lining, it's just a case of putting it inside the coat, wrong sides together, turning the seam allowances under and hand-stitching it down. The coat fabric is this very thick boiled wool, so it's not even like the stitches might show through to the other side. If I was just lining this coat, then I'd be done by now, but I have a bit of a surprise up my sleeve, so let's get on with looking at the pattern and how I've altered it. The skirt is just a very simple half circle drafted from scratch, to the length I want and the waist measurements of the finished coat. The body is the interesting bit and it's gone through a couple of iterations. For starters, the smallest size for this pattern is a 34 to 36 inch chest, which is already big on me before you even start factoring in the embarrassingly large amount of ease big pattern companies add in. And if you've only ever sewn with women's patterns, guess what? The men's ones are even worse in this respect. So as a basic pattern, I've got new front and back pieces where I've removed something like 4 inches in total from the circumference, plus that is extended into the shoulder so they're an inch smaller across the top. For this pattern, however, I looked at some references and it seems like for overcoats in the Regency and Romantic eras, it was fairly common for them to not have side seams. So I went ahead and joined the front and side back pieces together into one. Since I'm going to be doing a bit of pattern drafting on the big paper anyway, provided my supervisor here signs off on the quality of my work, I can show you how I usually do the adjustment to join two pattern pieces from a commercial pattern together. It's definitely not the conventional way of doing it, but I am all about those shortcuts. The first thing you do is trace off the first pattern piece, and you can ignore the fact that I'm using a piece I've already drafted. It's the same as a tissue pattern piece in the important factor that it still has the commercial standard seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters included. Along the seam where I want to join the two pieces, I'm using my transparent quilting ruler, one of the best sewing purchases I've ever made. I use this nearly every day, and I'm drawing a line 5/8 of an inch in from the edge of the pattern piece. That's where the sewing line would be. Then I'm adding a second guideline 5/8 of an inch further in from that, so that I can line up the edge of the second pattern piece with this guideline and trace off the rest of the new pattern from there. I find this a lot quicker and easier than tracing both pieces separately and then trying to tape them together. This is the method I use to combine the front and back side pieces of this coat into one, but here I'm actually joining the front and back at the shoulder to create a collar facing piece. Why do I need this? Well, if you've been around YouTube for a while, you may be familiar with the cut of women's clothing, probably one of the more frustrating historical costuming resources out there. It's less likely that you'll have encountered its less prestigious but equally frustrating and still not reprinted counterpart, the cut of men's clothing. This book somehow manages to be slightly worse than the cut of women's clothing in every possible way, and yet also the only even vaguely comprehensive resource on historical menswear out there. Emphasis on the vague. Which led me to the section where all of the 19th century is squished into one chapter, there's no comprehensive overview for any given decade, and not all of the plates are dated. But there is this reproduced plate from the Tailor's Friendly Instructor, 1822, thank you Google Books, what did we do before the internet? Which has no instructions or further information, but shows what I believe to be the drafting layout for an overcoat with capes. And I thought, well, capes? So something I'd seen a lot of other YouTubers do is that when they're undecided about something, they ask their Instagram followers to weigh in. And this seems to work really well for some people. And I can only conclude that I am way too opinionated for this to ever work for me. So I asked Instagram whether or not I should do capes on the coat. I have many answers in, and my conclusion is that you're all wrong. Now, admittedly, some of you are wrong in that way that when you ask a question because you just want to see if you're disappointed by the answer. A bunch of people said, no, don't add capes. And I was like, I'm gonna add capes though. That's definitely happening now. Absolutely no way I'm leaving this alone. But then a whole, more than half of the people said, make capes that you can button on and off. And I literally, this is no shade to any of you, I cannot imagine anything worse. I've had collars like that, they're awful. I didn't realize people liked that. It's always a terrible idea, especially with how heavy that fabric is and the fact that it's going to be probably 3 or 4. Most overcoats seem to have 3 or 4, so we're not doing that. There's no buttons on this coat, there's no buttons. I don't want to add buttons just around the hide them under the collar. It doesn't have one. one? It doesn't have one, so I'd have to give it a collar in the first place, which is not set up to do. It's cut back, there's no seam allowance. It's net around the neck. So that's just not happening. I love you all dearly. Thank you so much for giving me your opinions. I respect them, but respectfully, you are incorrect. To be honest, I think what swayed me in the end was several people were like, don't put capes on it because they liked the line of the shoulder or they liked the waistline. I realize it looks like it has a nipped waist and it does have those little puffy top sleeves. The thing is, it's a men's coat. The waistline is on my hip bones. It's really drops because it's not meant to be, that's not super period accurate, but it fit better with a longer waist, a sort of more masculine cut there. It's not a historical recreation, it's ultimately being viewed by a modern audience trying to imagine themselves in a pseudo-historical time period. You gotta make some concessions to the way people's brains work as modern humans when you're trying to make something that reads right. But yeah, it's not supposed to have a nipped in waist. I don't want it to have little puffy sleeves. There's just nothing I could do about that without messing around with the pattern and potentially like my arm movement. So I have absolutely no problems covering those up and making it look more bulky and large, like it's supposed to be bulky and large. It's a men's overcoat. This is all an incredibly complicated and long-winded way of saying capes. We're doing capes. Capes are happening. Apologies to everyone who said no capes or removable capes. But I have decided, it is decreed, I am the only god here. Capes are happening. And thus I used the collar facing I just drafted and extended it into a not quite a full circle cape, using the body pieces to judge how long I wanted the longest to be. The plate in the book showed that in the draft the capes came up higher in the front neck and were angled outwards, inwards. They extend past the front of the coat at the bottom front corner, probably to make them flare nicer over the chest. Instead of trying to draft that in, I just cut and retaped the front 2 inches of the pattern higher and at an angle, and then smoothed in the curves. Pattern drafting is not as complicated as people think it is. My sole concession to all the people who wanted removable capes is that I am mounting them onto a separate facing. I have added a very simple collar and am now lining up the centre back seams of the longest cape with the centre back of the facing. Because this fabric is so thick, I decided I would sew each cape in place at a slightly different margin and then trim back the seam allowance so that I could stagger the seams and not have to sew through 5 layers of boiled wool to attach the final one. In theory, this was a good idea, and I thought long and hard about how I would do it and in which order, but somehow managed to forget all of that in the moment, including the fact that the front edges are also staggered. The end result looks very messy at the front corners, so I think I need something to cover those up and make it look nice and neat. Currently, I have the cape facing pinned onto the coat, as I want to wear it at least once without the capes. The final event of the system I made this for is coming up, and I don't think the capes work as well for that character. I've got a whole video talking about that costume if you'd like to see more and see the coat in its original unlined state. However, ultimately I think I will sew the facing in place. I'll technically be able to remove it if I ever decide I don't want to wear the capes again, but the overall look of the coat is, I think, much improved by the capes, and I don't want to be fussing around with safety pins through boiled wool all the time. Not to mention if the safety pins get wet, it's definitely a coat for wearing in bad weather, and I'm happy to commit to that given I live in the north of England. I hope you've enjoyed this video and are inspired to try some irresponsible pattern hacking on the basis of one image from a period drafting manual with no further information. It's really not all that difficult, and it usually works.